Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I'll spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. I'm sure many of you have heard that quote from Abraham Lincoln, and it's basically a quote about the importance of preparation and getting things ready before actually executing what you're trying to do. Now we're going to kind of spin that quote a little bit, because over the last few weeks in my classes and in my own training, I've put a lot of focus back into the fundamentals, the basics. And today I thought it'd be a good idea to go through why it's so important to always go back to the basics and the fundamentals and ingrain them into your mindset and into your training. So if you know you're guilty of occasionally leaving these things on the table for the more exciting, more advanced stuff, then this is a good reminder of their importance in your training. Before we get started with them, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button. We're coming up on a big subscriber milestone, and I'd really like to creep up there just that little bit faster. And apparently you doing that little click for me really helps us out. So thank you guys. Let's get it started. Fundamentals win fights. Now, any of you that have trained with me, especially any of you that have competed under me, you'll know that I spout that one out all the time. It's the basics that win fights. It's the fundamental techniques. They're the ones that get the job done 9 out of 10 times. We all love a highlight reel, spinning kick knockout, or a flying armbar, whatever your discipline is, whatever your martial art is. But if you really look at the numbers, the vast majority of bouts, fights, competitions are won using the fundamentals, using what you learnt in maybe the first month of training. That first time you walk into a boxing gym and they teach you that 1-2, it's probably that's going to win you the majority of your fights. You go kickboxing and they teach you that rear body kick, guess what? It's probably going to win you some fights. Go to your first BJJ class where classically they like to teach you the armbar from mount. Guess what? It's going to win you some fights, guys. The fundamentals are the things that get the job done in the easiest and most efficient manner. The problem is sometimes the word basic has negative connotations. Yeah, you hear people saying you're being a basic bitch, stuff like this. And the word basic kind of makes people feel like, well, I don't want to be basic. I want to be advanced. I want to work on the hard stuff. I want to work on the tricky stuff. So I try not to use the word basic too much. I much prefer the word fundamentals or foundations or base principles, the stuff that everything else is built upon. Because if you've got your advanced techniques, but you've got bad basics, that's gonna all unravel for you very quickly. A lot can be done by just working on the stuff that's been tried and tested over time. And that's what the fundamentals represent. All right, so that's our first reason to really focus back in on these fundamentals. Number 2 is, when you're tired, what is your default settings? Any of you that have competed in a martial art can probably already relate to this one. You went in with a strategy, maybe a game plan. You had all this stuff that you wanted to do and achieve in the fight, that you thought you could get away with it. You've been drilling it, you've been working it for weeks. You get into the fight gets to be harder than what you expected, you start getting tired and you default back to your base settings. All that stuff you had planned goes out the window and you go back to what you know and trust and what you do in the gym all the time. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is a bad thing, because if what your default setting is a sharp 1-2 or a great head kick, then we don't really have a problem here. But the issue is that for many people, what they default to is things like dropping their guard down a little lower, not pulling their punches back to their chin, leaving themselves exposed and losing their distance management against their opponent. All these fundamental mistakes that they start making when tiredness and fatigue start to kick in. And this is why it's so important to always go back to these base principles, to practice the foundational movements that when you get tired, when your body is not really connected to your mind anymore and you're just running on autopilot, that at least your autopilot is keeping you safe, and defaulting to techniques that, like we said before, they're tried and tested. They can get the job done. You don't want it to default to weird, outlandish stuff that's not going to be effective in the fight, especially when you know you're fatigued. The great thing about a lot of the basics, the fundamentals, is they're very efficient. They don't use an awful lot of energy. So when you're tired and you can only throw a 1-2, if that 1-2 is super sharp because it's super ingrained in you, it can often be enough to still get the job done. And finally, use it or you'll lose it. This last one rings true to me the older I get, and any of you veterans in the game can probably attest to this one. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. The body and the mind don't really like holding on to things that they're not making use of. And this is like an automated kind of clear out that it does to not hang on to useless information or even actions that it's just not going to see a perceived use for in the future. And the only way it knows whether or not you're going to need it in the future is if you're actively doing it consistently over time. So some of this is useful. For example, that stuff that you learn in high school geography can probably go and be replaced with things like the date that you need to file your taxes or your daughter's birthday. But it can also work against you, and in your martial arts training, this can be very obvious very quickly. If you don't regularly practice stretching and regularly practice throwing high kicks, your body will very quickly feel that that's not something that you necessarily need to be able to do, and it's just going to remove it from you. You're going to lose the timing and you're going to lose the accuracy associated with your mind, but also your body is just going to physically give up on that amount of flexibility, the strength, the mobility, and you're going to lose the ability to do it. And it's much harder to get something like that back than it is to just maintain it over time. A real typical one that you see for boxers is not pulling their punches back to their guard after they throw them. They learn that on day one. They're taught, hands up by the chin, throw that punch out, and it comes back to the chin each time, and that's all gravy. But once they start learning more advanced, longer, bigger combinations, that kind of stuff kind of goes into the background, and before you know it, they're leaving their chin exposed and they're getting caught out more often than not. And again, a lot of this is understandable because it's that excitement about practicing advanced principles, about getting away from the basics because you've been doing that stuff for years and you now want to learn things that are more exciting. And that's great, and you should do that. But it's so important to always just touch base with that stuff because, like I said, the mind and the body are not going to hold on to it if you're not regularly kind of reintroducing it and reinforcing it in training and in practice. And here's the big problem with all of this. All this advanced stuff that we talk about is built on the foundations of your fundamentals. So if your basics of your stance, your guard, your timing, your distance management, if all these things are off and if all of these things are blunt, you haven't sharpened this axe, then all that advanced stuff that you're trying to do on top of it is probably going to be just as ineffective. It's all well and good having an amazing spinning kick, but if you don't know how to time it, if you don't know how to judge the distance correctly, if you don't know how to read your opponent's guard position and what they're doing in order to actually land it, you're probably just going to hit a lot of thin air. So there we have it, guys. I hope that's been helpful. Get back to your fundamentals, go and do a training session now and get back to the basics. The stuff you learned on week 1 through to 6, go and just loop that stuff over and re-ingrain it both in your mind and in your body. If you found this message helpful, this video helpful, like I said, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We've got new videos coming every week, and I will see you on the next one.